Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here with yet another gun to review. This is just an initial review. I have not really put a ton of rounds to this particular gun yet, but I don't greatly expect things to change with this particular gun, so I'm going to go ahead and put an initial review out there. The gun is the Bersa TPR9. Now this gun has already been checked and cleared for those of you who are concerned about safety, which you should be, but it's already been checked and cleared, so that's not an issue here. The TPR9 is the big brother of the TPR9C, which by the way has also been checked and cleared. And this is the gun that I owned first and frankly have really come to like in a lot of regards. And you can see that I put some aftermarket grip texture on there. This is some of the standard Talon grips that they have for the TPR9C, I should say. This is the compact version, the TPR9C. And really came to like this gun, and I wanted something that was full size that could complement this little one. And the reason why I like full size 9mm guns, anything, well, I would say more like beyond full size. A lot of people consider 4 inches to be full size. I don't. 4 inches to me is more so in line with a compact. And the TPR9C I would actually really consider to be more of a subcompact. A 3 1/4 inch barrel is not a very big barrel at all. So I would really consider that more of a subcompact. But the reason why I like these larger guns, and particularly 9mm guns that have a barrel length of 4.5 inches or more. This one's about 4 3/4. Reason why I like guns with the longer barrels is because 9mm really comes into its own with a longer barrel. If you have a longer barrel on it, like I said, about 4.5 inches or longer, you start getting into the realm where the kinetic energy of the 9mm will start to overlap with the available kinetic energies for 45. Now 45 is still capable of having quite a bit more kinetic energy if you have a fairly large handgun with a pretty hot load behind it. But depending on the ammunition that you're comparing and the size of gun that you're comparing, there is an envelope in which 9mm will overlap with 45. And it's usually on the larger side of 9mm. You get a little bit longer barrel, you get a more efficient burn, results in higher velocities, which equates to more muzzle energy. And so a full-size 9mm is actually a little bit better than some people think. I'm not saying that it's necessarily equivalent to a lot of the more powerful calibers. If you talk about same barrel length to same barrel length, yeah, the caliber that's generally more powerful is generally going to be more powerful. But if you're comparing something that's full-size to something that has a shorter barrel or a little bit weaker load, well, then there's going to be some overlap. And so there are some 9mm guns that actually will be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than some 45 guns, with depending on how they're loaded, and also depending on the barrel length of those 45s. So that's the reason why I like these longer guns. And like I said, I wanted something that could pair up with my compact pretty well, had basically the same controls and those kinds of features, and indeed it does. And like the small one, like the TPR9C, one of the things I'm pleased to report is that it's cycled everything basically out of the box just fine. It technically wasn't quite out of the box. I never do things directly out of the box. I always take the gun home and I get it cleaned up first. And I also will kind of deburr the parts a little bit on my own before I shoot a lot of them. And it's just something that helps with all guns across the spectrum. And Bersas don't tend to have the highest quality control that's out there. They have, as the saying goes, they have really great bones, and that the major components that are there are actually pretty excellent, but fit and finish isn't always so great on Bersas. And then the springs that they put in Bersas from the factory are sometimes not so great, and those will sometimes need to be replaced fairly early on. But aside from those issues, Bersas are great guns. Like I said, they have great bones, and with a little bit of time and attention, they can really become great guns for you. And one of the things that pleases me the most about this gun is I was able to get this on a pretty good sale. And so this gun cost me, oh, what was it? when everything was said and done, including the FFL transfer fee, it was like less than $316 when everything was said and done, which is pretty good. Normally these guns are about $400 guns, and then whatever your FFL transfer fee is going to be if you buy from an online retailer. In store, it'll usually be a little bit more expensive. You'll see $400 to like $450 for these kinds of guns, but still they're on the low end of the spectrum as far as cost is concerned, and the quality is actually pretty high. Like I said, the fit and finish isn't always so great, and that does need to be taken into account. And my standard process for all my guns is, of course, take it home and clean it. And when these ones come from the factory, they are pretty much like caked in packing grease. Not a good idea to fire it out of the box. No, they have them completely greased up, and it's not good. So you definitely want to clean them, and the first time you clean them, it's a really good idea to use a decent amount of solvent on a lot of the components. Normally I don't recommend a use of a lot of solvent on semi-autos in general, especially on handguns. You don't tend to need a whole lot of solvent, but fresh out of the box, solvent is going to be your friends on these ones, because like I said, they are just packed in grease. And then make sure they're well lubed up. CLP in most areas will do just fine, with a bit of specific semi-auto lubrication oil in the key places, especially the rails, and also along the barrel and along the top of the chamber, places like that. And then once you get it cleaned and lubed up, the thing that I do after that, I head drop the magazine, and yes, the magazine is empty, and yes, the gun is empty. Like I said, I already cleared them off of camera. But once I go ahead and I get the gun cleaned, then one of the things that I will do with new guns very frequently is I will just sit there and cycle the action for a little while. Usually while I'm watching TV or something like that, if I have something, something else to kind of entertain me, just sit there running the action for a while, run the buttons, and of course the trigger in there as well, just smooth everything out. And then after that, I'll usually clean it one more time, because when you sit there and you run the action a bunch of times, and you can do it hundreds or maybe even 1,000 times, usually doesn't hurt the gun in any significant way. It just clears everything out. It might become a problem as far as the springs are concerned, because springs have a given lifetime for the number of times that they can be compressed and released. And so it might affect that, and the Bersa springs that they come with from the factory are not the best in the world, so it can be a little bit of an issue there. But after you do that, you'll probably deburr a lot of stuff, and so there's going to be a lot of grit in the gun, so go ahead and clean it again. Usually you don't need to use a whole lot of solvent that time, because you're just going to be wiping out excess grit. Do make sure that you use some kind of cloth material to get the grit out though, and then of course go ahead and lube it up again, and then it should be ready to fire without any problems whatsoever. And that was the case with this one. Now, I didn't exactly follow that regimen with the little one. I just cleaned it once, took it out and shot it, and it was fine. And with most guns, you don't have to sit there and run the action to deburr and all those kinds of things. It's just that on this one, I noticed that it was just a little tight when I first got it, and so that concerned me a little bit. So went through and just ran the action a bunch of times to get rid of that. But when I took it out and fired it, no hangups, and I fired multiple kinds of ammunition through it. Didn't have any aluminum case this time, but I did have a couple of different kinds of brass plinking ammo. Some of the Remington UMC 115 grain, and then the Blazer brass 115 grain as well. Ran both of those just fine. I also had some of the Sig Sauer 124 grain non-plus P defensive hollow points, and those ran just fine. And I also had some of the Fort Scott Munitions 80 grain ammunition, and there was a slight problem with that ammo in that if you fully loaded the magazine and tried to load it into the gun with the slide closed, it didn't want to go in all the way, and that's because those bullets are really long on the front end, and so that created a problem. But as long as you opened up the action, then stuck the magazine in, and then slingshot the magazine over it, it'll work just fine. But that was a bullet size issue, and those are rather abnormal bullets in that regard. But as far as cycling them from that point forward, no problems with all of those ammunition types. So ran from 80 grain to 124 grain, and like I said, in the future want to do further testing and we'll see how things go. But cycled all of them just fine, which is typical for Bersas. My little TPR9C also will eat any kind of ammo. It's not picky at all. And one of the things that I love about Bersas, and it wound up being true on the full-size one, the TPR9, and it was also true of the little one, the TPR9C, is that point of impact shift is not a big deal with these guns. There's a lot of guns that are out there and a lot of other semi-autos that are out there that, depending on the ammunition that you put in them, you can get pretty significant point of impact shifts. And granted, I don't shoot as far as some people do. I usually shoot 10 or 15 yards away from me. That's where I put my target up. But with some guns, I can notice a distinct difference in the location and also the size of the pattern with some guns. For example, my CZP09 will pattern very differently with different kinds of ammunition. And for example, it absolutely hates the Federal 115 aluminum case ammo, the 115 grain aluminum case ammo. Absolutely hates the stuff. It will be about 6 inches off at, well, 10 to 15 yards of experience, about the same thing, but even within about 10 yards, there will sometimes be a 6-inch difference in center of group between the centers of the groups that I'm shooting. Significant difference with that gun. My Bersas, though, they take the aluminum stuff just great, and I tested that with the little one, the TPR9C. I've tested the aluminum in, and the point of impact has not significantly changed. The group size with the aluminum ammo is a little bit wider because the load doesn't seem to be as consistent, but as far as the center of the group, it's basically the same as everything else. And with this one, with the ammunition that I put through it, all the way from the 80 grain Fort Scott ammunition all the way up to the 124 grain 6 Sauer ammunition, the center of the groups was the same, and the size of the groups was also very comparable. I didn't measure them precisely, but they all looked to the naked eye to be roughly the same size and roughly the same location, roughly the same shape, all that kind of stuff. Point of impact shift for Bersas just really isn't a big deal, and it's one of the things I like about it is you can sight it in with almost any kind of ammunition you want, and it's going to work for pretty much anything else that you throw in it. I really like that about these guns. Now, as you saw with my Bersa TPR9C, I'm not an overly big fan of the grips that they come with, because the grips that they come with tend to be rather slick. It's a hard plastic, and there's not really anything in the way of stippling. There's some striations in there, and the back strap is not absolutely awful, but it's not great either. And so on the last gun, of course, I went and got some Talon grips to put on there, and that does seem to have improved things quite a bit, and I do like it. And I'm debating whether or not I want to do that with my full-size one. My full-size one is big enough that I can get a pretty decent grip on it without resorting to texture changes, you know, just a mechanical grip. Although having the texture in there would be kind of nice. The only problem is that for concealed carry, you usually wind up with a gun right up against your skin sometimes if you're not wearing an undershirt or something like that. And personally, I don't really like to wear undershirts all that much, especially if I don't have to. And so having a kind of smooth grip is nice for that. It's not so great for shooting, but it is nice for carrying. And so I'm still kind of on the fence on that one. Do I want to go the route that I did with the small one and go ahead and get the grips? And this didn't turn out bad at all. I don't regret that decision, but the question is, do I need it? And what I gain in accuracy, is it really worth the loss in comfort that I would have in carrying it? And given that this is a bigger gun and it's easier to get a better grip on it, maybe so, maybe not, I don't know. We'll see what the future holds on that one. I still have not made up my mind on that particular point. But But in terms of accuracy out of the box, it was shooting low right. And my little Bersa TPR9C was basically the same thing, except it was high right, but both of them shot a little bit to the right. So for some reason, compared to the people at Bersa, compared to me, they seem to shoot to the right of me. Well, actually, that would be more to the left of me. But we seem to be off in the same direction consistently between guns. They always come in a little bit to the right. But the nice thing about the sights on these things is that you can just drift them with a punch and a mallet. It's a fairly easy dovetail on them. And so you can knock them around whichever way you want. So if it shoots one way or the other for you, just knock it in the direction that you want it to go, on the rear sight that is, and presto, you're pretty much right on. And like I said, once you get it sighted in with one kind of ammunition, as long as it's a fairly typical ammunition, it's going to be sighted in for everything else. You know, Bersas just do not change point of impact all that much between the different bullet weights and the different bullet shapes. Hollow points, full metal jackets, spear points. In my experience, they all have pretty much the same center of impact between 10 and 15 yards. And that is my experience with both of these guns. And like I said, I got this one on sale for fairly cheap, but even if it wasn't on sale, we're still talking about a roughly $400 gun. That's not bad. And yeah, this one did come in a little bit rough, but like I said, just work the slide a bit, work the trigger a bit, and it smoothed out pretty well. It does still have a pretty heavy trigger pull. I'd say right now it's somewhere between 9 and 11 pounds. But if that winds up being anything like my TPR9C, that will smooth out in time. Right now, this little Bersa is sitting at just around 8 pounds for its double action pull, and these are double single action guns, so it has a little decocker on them that's ambidextrous, and most of the controls except for the magazine release are of course ambidextrous, but the magazine release you can actually take out and swap to the other side, so even though it's not technically ambidextrous, it is swappable, and that is the case with the full-size one as well. And so for those of you guys who are left-handed out there, it might be something to look at. One thing that I did mention with the TPR9C when I did the review on that one is I mentioned that depending on how you hold your offhand, if you're left-handed, sometimes you might wind up putting your thumb on that transfer bar. You can see the transfer bar moving forward as I pull the trigger back. And depending on how you hold your offhand, you can wind up putting your thumb on that, and that could be a bit of an issue. If you thrust your thumb far enough forward and get it onto that pad that's up there, not a huge issue though. Another thing I like about the full-size one, in addition to better ballistic performance, is it does have a larger tang on the back end compared to the compact. Compact kind of has a little nub of a tang. Full-size one, though, has a pretty good-sized tang on it, and because of that, I don't have to worry about hammer bite at all with this one. In the TPR9C video, I mentioned that I do sometimes get hammer bite from this one, and people were like, oh no, I never get hammer bite from it, Well, I hold the gun different than a lot of other people do, and if you have a different grip, that sometimes happens. And I personally don't like changing my grip to accommodate each gun. I like using one basically universal grip that I can use on every single one of my guns. And for me, the purpose of your grip is to achieve accuracy, not comfort. And so for me, a little bit of hammer bite doesn't bug me that much, and I still shoot it, and it's fine. It is a little bit annoying, but it's not going to keep me from firing the gun. Okay, and it's certainly not going to make me change my grip. My grip is going to be the same on all of my guns. I use the grip that gives me the best accuracy on all the guns that I have available to me. So it's always that very far back grip where my wrist is in line with the barrel. And then I put my finger over the trigger guard, grasp forward, push out like that. And I like that grip, and it achieves good accuracy for me compared to a lot of other grips, and so that's what I always do. Those of you out there who believe that you basically have to have a grip that provides perfect comfort in all cases and never ever gives you hammer bites or anything like that, I disagree with you. Okay? For me, accuracy is first, and if you get a little bit of hammer bite in the process, no big deal. I'm not dripping blood or something like that, and I didn't wind up losing a finger or something, so who cares? But I also understand that that would really, 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 really bug some people. Some people really don't like hammer bite at all, and so they'll find a different grip, and if they want to use a different grip, that's fine if it works for them. But there's some people out there who just got really weirded out when I mentioned that the TPR9C, the subcompact version, gives me hammer bite. It's like, oh no, well here's all these suggestions on how to hold the gun and all those kinds of things, and I'm sitting there going, you know what, I know that you can hold a gun differently to achieve different results. That's not the reason why I have that grip. Thanks, but no thanks. Just putting that out there for those people who are concerned about it. But back onto the gun itself. Another thing that I did find that was rather impressive about it is this, of course, is the threaded barrel design, and I got that because it makes the barrel longer, past 4.5 inches, which is what I wanted, just to achieve the kind of ballistic performance that I like. And on the threaded barrel, I don't know how well you guys can or cannot see that, but at the end of it, there is actually an O-ring. On a lot of guns that I've gotten that have threaded barrels, they don't put the O-ring on, which is really annoying. I don't usually use suppressors all that often, if at all. If someone else has a 9mm suppressor that will fit on my guns, I certainly don't mind borrowing it, but I don't own any myself. The main reason why I get threaded barrels, especially on handguns, is because it makes the barrel a little bit longer, gives a little bit better ballistic performance. But that O-ring is still really important even if you don't have a suppressor that you're putting on it, because it helps that thread protector stay seated properly and you don't have to worry about over-tightening and under-tightening as much. For example, my CZP09, which is significantly more expensive than this gun, I got with a threaded barrel, and of course it has a thread protector on the end, but it doesn't have an O-ring, and so you wind up with the possibility of, or at least an increased risk of, stripping the threads on it, just because of that. That O-ring really does help secure it, and it helps prevent over-tightening and under-tightening kind of issues. So even though it's a relatively cheap gun, that is actually a really nice inclusion, and it really doesn't cost that much to put an O-ring on things. But CZ, for some reason, hasn't gotten that clue. In fact, a lot of handgun manufacturers haven't got the clue that shipping it out with an O-ring on it is a really good idea. Bersa has that understanding, though. So overall, very pleased with it. It is a good shooter. It's accurate. Like I said, once you get it sighted in, you've basically got it sighted in for everything, because Bersas, at least in my experience with these two 9mm handguns, they don't suffer from major points of impact shift problems. Now, granted, if you were doing it at different ranges, with different bullet weights, with different powder charges, you could start to see some major differences, but like I said, in the 10 to 15 yard range that I shoot at, typically, don't notice any major shifts. There's a little bit of variation here and there, but nothing to write home about. Nothing that's going to take you off of an 8-inch target. Great little shooters. Great little shooters, highly accurate. And the trigger pull on them is a little weird to get used to. The double action pull is definitely heavy, especially on this one. Like I said, 9 to 11 pounds right now for the double action pull. And it starts to stack just at the very end, and so if you're someone who gets kind of jittery as you go through the trigger pull, yeah, this isn't going to be great for that. But with a little bit of practice, you really can make it work for you. And my thing that I found with it is, with these triggers, it's more of like pulling down through it instead of pulling straight back. And when I pull down through it, get a really smooth sight picture as it breaks, and pulling down on it gives me good leverage on the end of that trigger, so that I can get past a little bit of that stacking. But the trigger is still fairly smooth, and once you get into single action, it's very easy to work with, and that reset is almost non-existent. Okay, go ahead and do the reset again here. that's the reset. You can see that the trigger is still almost all the way back and it's already reset. And then pulling forward on it is not bad. That's probably about a 4.5 pound trigger pull right there. Not bad at all. This is a very workable trigger, especially in single action mode, and the double action does take a little bit to get used to, but it's not bad. And in my experience, put a few hundred rounds through them, or maybe a few thousand rounds as the case may be, and you'll eventually get them worked down to the point where it's very manageable. Like I said, it's about an 8 pound trigger pull now for the double action, and the single action is probably on the high side of 3, low side of 4. And that's not a bad trigger pull at all. When I first got this thing, I complained about the trigger pull because I don't like heavy trigger pulls on small guns. I like the trigger pull to be proportional to the size of the gun, basically. And now it is smoothed out to the point where it is pretty much where I want it. And I really like that. This one, I don't mind the heavy trigger pull on it. 9 to 11 pounds for a full-size handgun for me is not a big issue at all. If it smooths out, I'm of course not going to complain, but it still holds a good steady sight picture for me just fine, even with the heavy trigger pull. Like I said, a little bit of change in technique going through the double action. I usually pull down and through instead of straight back, but other than that, it's just fine. And now that my full size and my compact have basically the same controls, and the trigger weights are different, but the style of trigger pull is still very much the same, really just kind of simplifies things for me all the way around, and I like it. So overall, very satisfied with it. I don't know what I'm going to wind up doing with the grips yet. For the moment, I'm actually more tempted just to kind of leave them alone and just kind of play with that for a while. It's big enough that I think I can get a decent enough grip without having to rely on friction. And so I just might leave them be for a little while. But yeah, other than that, great. And the extra work that I did of running the action when I first got it, I don't think is actually necessary. But like I said, the gun felt just a little gritty when I first got it, so that had me a little bit concerned. And if I run into something like that with a new gun, I'm going to try to work that all out before I get to the range. Because if something happens at the range, well, then you get frustrated because that's your time to shoot and all those kinds of things, and it's not good. It's usually best to head off those problems before you ever get to them. And so that's why I did that. But I don't consider it necessary, and I've never actually had a problem with a Bersa before where it didn't fire out of the box. In fact, I've never had a Bersa malfunction on me other than like parts breaking and those kinds of things, but in terms of it just not cycling correctly or being missprung or something like that, never had that issue with Bersas. The only issue that I have had with Bersas are the springs. And this is a problem that's more unique to me than it would be to a lot of other people. I tend to dry fire my handguns quite a bit, and so I put a lot of pressure, especially on the return trigger spring. Much more than a lot of other people do. And so for me with Bersas, with these particular models, the TPR series, the thing that I have found that I need to do with them is basically just keep a supply of return trigger springs on hand. And with certain guns, there are just certain parts that are going to break in the cycle, and you know that they are. And so you just prepare for it. For example, on a lot of semi-auto rifles, and a lot of semi-autos in general, actually, you know that eventually the extractor is going to go, and especially the extractor spring and those kinds of things. So having spare extractors and spare extractor springs is a good idea. Eventually, way down the line, usually thousands of rounds down the line, you'll want to replace the recoil springs and things like that. In general, on semi-auto, springs are just something that you can wear out. And me, I dry fire my guns way more than I live fire them. A conservative estimate would be that I probably dry fire my handguns 4 to 5 times more often than I actually do live fire with them. And that's going to wear out the springs a lot faster. And so that's just one of the realities that I have to deal with in that regard. But getting aftermarket parts for Bersa, I found, is not too bad. There is company online, I forget the name of them, but they have factory Bersa parts. I can't get some of the upgrades that I can get with other handguns. A lot of other handguns you can get factory parts and you can get upgraded parts. And I usually get the upgraded parts so that I don't have to replace parts as often. Bersa, I've only been able to find factory parts, but they are available, they are out there. And frankly, Bersas are not fun to work on. They're kind of complicated little beasts, and it can take a while to get them taken apart and put back together again. But it is doable. There are some handguns out there, and some guns in general out there, that you take them apart, you're never going to get them back together. Some Kel-Tecs are like that, for example, that if you take them apart beyond the general field strip, you get them taken apart further than that, you get a bunch of little screws and washers and tiny little springs that fit in weird places and all kinds of things in there that when they're on the factory floor and there's a little jig that they're sitting in that you can just pop things into, it's not bad. But when you're sitting at a table and you don't have the little fancy jigs to work with, they're just a pain to deal with. I will take a Bersa over one of those just about any day. But still, Bersas are not my favorite. I like working on, say, CZs, for example. CZs are pretty easy to take apart and put back together. Bersas are worse, definitely, and they take quite a bit of time, but still doable. And reliable. Like I said, I've never had one fail to function out of the box, and I have yet to have a malfunction with one, period. Like I said, the closest to a malfunction I've gotten is with this one trying to insert a full magazine of the full Fort Scott ammunition with the slide closed. And the reason for that is just that the Fort Scott ammunition has a really long front end that frankly is beyond the normal envelope of 9mm ammunition. That is an ammunition problem, that's not a gun problem. But even with that one, all I had to do was just open up the slide, put the magazine in first, and then slingshot the slide in. And I love the placement of the decocker on these ones. For anyone who doesn't know, Bersas are kind of a Beretta knockoff. In fact, a lot of the early designers of Bersa actually used to work for Beretta, and then they left Beretta and they formed their own company. So they're very Beretta-esque in a lot of ways, and you get a lot of the benefits of the accuracy and the reliability from that. Like I said, the quality of the strings is usually not so good, but in pretty much every other regard, they're pretty good. I like Bersas in that regard. But I love that they changed the position of the decocker safety. A lot of the Berettas will have the decocker safety up on the slide, like the famous Beretta 92FS, also known as the M9, if we're talking about it when it's in military use. Has the decocker up on the slide, and I hate slide-mounted safeties. One of the things I like about the TPR series, unlike the 380 series, unlike the 380 Bersa guns, because they also have slide-mounted safeties, which is awful, but the other calibers that they have, the 9s, the 40s, and the 45s, and yes, Bersa does make 40s and 45s as well. They move they move the safety down off of the slide and into the frame, and it also doubles as the decocker, as is common with a lot of them. But it's just a more common position that's easier to activate and much more in line with what you would normally expect from most other guns. It just makes operating it that much smoother and that much more natural. I really like that about them. Same complaints that I've always had about them is that they are kind of clunky and bulky compared to a lot of other guns. They're definitely not as svelte as a lot of other guns that are out there on the market. But for the price range, and considering that, like I said, I've never had one malfunction on me. Yes, I have had springs wear out and things like that. But as far as a flaw in the design itself, nothing like that ever. And like I said, point of impact in the 10 to 15 yard range is excellent. With a variety of different bullet types and bullet weights, it's really hard to ask for anything else from a gun, especially when you consider the price category. Even if this was a $500 or a $600 gun, it would still be suitable and usable, but the fact that it's a $400 gun and occasionally a $300 gun, that is really pretty awesome and very hard to beat. So all in all, I am very happy with this purchase. And I think it's going to be a great gun moving forward. I have no reason to believe that it's not. And if my compact is anything to go by, it's going to smooth out with time. The trigger pull is going to become easier. General actions and movements and all the various pieces are going to smooth out. The accuracy is that I've seen with it. I haven't put a ton of rounds through it, just a few magazines worth, but accuracy out of the box isn't bad. And this one I do have quite a few more rounds through, and it's managed to maintain that accuracy just fine. Really nothing to complain about, and so I'm really looking forward to seeing this thing run in the future. Is it as good as my CZP09, which has been my favorite up until this point? No, it's not quite as accurate, at least based on the shooting that I've done with it so far. But it's really close. And considering that my CZ was twice as expensive as this gun, that's not a small issue. Now granted, the range I'm firing at is only 10 to 15 yards and I'm not the best shot in the world, but functionally I can get pretty close with this for a whole lot less money. That's pretty cool. Anyways, thank you guys for your time and attention. Bye.